Welcome back, everyone, to Tiny Potato Studios for your Wednesday, March 25th session of Psych 202. If you are lucky enough to email me at any point this rest of the semester, you will see my lovely new addition to the bottom of my signature. Those of you who are not familiar with Brack, Brack has been a regular on Space Ghost Coast to Coast and used to crack us up every day when we were in college. He will also be featured on your comedy break for this lecture. Now, I'll tell you, there aren't a whole lot of slides left to go for Chapter 11. I'm going to finish this up, and then by the time it gets posted, I ought to have a study guide up for you for Chapter 11 so that you can prepare for Chapter 10 and 11 for Friday's exam. That being said, I have realized that, being a YouTuber is a whole different experience. I told my daughter, hey, everybody's gone home from college and everybody's gone home from the campus. Daddy's a YouTuber now. And she said, oh, like Preston. And I said, yeah. So I kind of figured I have to up my YouTube game a little bit to be more like Roblox Minecraft YouTuber Preston, which apparently means being incredibly surprised at everything you knew was coming. So let me give that a shot. Oh my God, guys! Oh my God, look at this! Oh my gosh, oh my God! So, okay, all right. I did not expect this. Wednesday, March 25th. Okay, all right. Well, let's just see what happens. I'm just going, okay, so I'm not going to do that. It's incredibly annoying. What we do have is a relatively reasonable take on personality theories. Okay, we went over some of the biggest personality theories. We went over some of the measurements of personality. We went over trait theories, and now there's a little bit of the softer side of personality theory that's nevertheless a bit more respected than psychoanalysis. First of those is going to be the social cognitive theories. The difference between these theories and the theories that we've been talking about right now, like the trait theories, are that the trait theories are really designed to designed to describe. To describe somebody's personality. What are the relevant dimensions that you can label and see who is different from who? But they don't really carry with them a reason why a person is the way that they are. It's just a description of how they happen to be. So the social cognitive theorists are taking that on and saying, all right, how is it that people get to have the personalities that they do? The humanists also are doing the same thing, and we'll get to them. But the social cognitive theorists are taking a page from the traditional psychology playbook and trying to figure out a system by which they can place all of the reasons why a person might have a particular personality in their own experience, history, learning, things like that. Okay, so that is sometimes a dead end in psychology, but it nevertheless still has a significant amount of respect, and so you should know these theories. Albert Bandura was one of the people who was very interested in this kind of idea. Bandura was mostly focused for a lot of his career on expanding on the ideas of behaviorism to include lessons that can be learned even if people aren't directly experiencing reward and punishment. And so along with Bandura's ideas and other theorists coming together, there was this idea of reciprocal determinism. And in this case, it's a three-way reciprocation that can help people to understand what's going on when you start talking about personality. At the top there is personal factors. That's what we would like to describe as personality. But the social cognitive theorists brought in the idea, hey, the thing that would make a personal factor what it is a couple of things. Personal factors can be observed through behavior. That's great. But someone's behavior also is a feedback mechanism for determining how it is that they're going to be in terms of their personal factors. So they might put a behavior out into the world, that behavior might be rewarded, that behavior might be punished, and so it comes back full circle to determine who it is that they're going to be the next time that they behave. Another big part of this, though, is the environment. And this isn't just generally environment as what we would largely call nurture, but a particular environment in which a person finds themselves at a specific time to see how they're going to behave and see how they're going to act. Your environment might be your environment at home, or your environment in a restaurant, or your environment in a car. And so that environment can actually have a big impact on which personal factors you're bringing to the front at that time. I know a lot of people who are very different people when driving a car than they are when they're sitting with you in their office. They can become very mean. You know what I mean. Might have a different personality under different circumstances. So those environments can have an effect on how you behave, which will be a reflection of your personal factors. But here's the biggest piece that I want to make sure you don't miss. The environment in which you find yourself can be a huge determinant of which one of your behaviors are punished or rewarded. If you're aggressive, if you're highly competitive, if you don't take anything from anybody, that might be a great way to be an athlete on an individual sport. But if you find yourself in a work group with people trying to do statistics, that kind of personality is not going to fly. It's not going to be awarded. It's not going to go well. And so one of the ways in which personal factors can influence environment is this. If you started to identify the environments in which you function well and have rewarded and have a lot of satisfaction, and you've started to identify those ways in which you don't get rewarded, you start choosing which environments you're going to put yourself in based on whether or not you're likely to have a good experience there. So some kids might drop out of school entirely. Some kids might drop out of after-school sports. Some people might decide that they're never going to work in groups again. That is a choice based on personal factors and behavioral feedback about what environment that person spends time in. So while it's very difficult to figure out exactly what the rules would be by which each one of these factors influence each other, and it's more than anything a collection of anecdotes and generalizations, there's a lot to be said for the idea that it is in fact true. Who you are affects your behavior gives you feedback about who you're going to be, and the environment that you find yourselves in determines what gets rewarded and punished, but it also means that you're going to pick your environments differently in the future. Next, as I promised, were the humanists. The humanists had several really famous people associated with them, Abraham Maslow, which we'll get to, but also this guy called Carl Rogers. Don't get him confused with Mr. Rogers, even though they really are not all that different from each other. Anyway, Carl Rogers, a famous psychotherapist from the humanist tradition, had a couple of concepts that he said were important in understanding people's personalities. The first one of those was the self-concept. That's kind of a loose term, but it means something specific to Rogers, which is this. Your self-concept is your idea about who you actually are. Rogers kind of thought there were no wrong or bad self-concepts. As long as you were being honest about your identity, who you are, then you were on the right track, you were doing the right thing, you were doing right by yourself, and that was a good thing. He had a lot of faith in people. That's the first part. The second part is this thing called positive regard. Positive regard is not exactly the same as liking somebody. Positive regard is not exactly the same as being nice to somebody. But positive regard is basically somebody acknowledging that your existence is valuable, that your self-concept is valid, and that you are a worthwhile being. Everything else can be details that you sort out, but positive regard is an acknowledgement of humanhood or humanity, which in this tradition is basically the only valuable thing and is infinitely valuable for each person. And we all want positive regard. We want people to regard us in a way that reflects that they value us as human beings. The actualizing tendency goes back to what I said about Carl Rogers having a lot of faith in humanity. Basically, his idea and the idea of the humanists was that it is the basic human nature to be good, to grow, and to fulfill themselves. They saw human nature as essentially something that, unless interfered with, would create love and community and growth and health and happiness in its appropriate proportions. They did not have a dark take on human nature. They didn't think that we were basically murderous except that society keeps us in line. They said that we were basically good except that society messes us up. And that's where the conditions of worth come in. Conditions of worth are society's way of getting us off track from the good and fulfilled and growth humans that we would otherwise be. Conditions of worth are when somebody gives you their positive regard on condition that. It's a way of exercising power over other people. Now, you're exercising power over people in your life all the time. You might have a boyfriend or girlfriend. You might love them very, very much. But nevertheless, you do exercise a certain amount of restraint in rewards or thank yous that you might give them because you want reciprocation in the relationship. So I have a hard time saying that conditions of worth always look like they're bad. But what Rogers was saying was that conditions of worth are not about what a particular person is doing at a particular time. They're not about getting along, washing the dishes on your night, or else you'll be confrontational with that person. Conditions of worth are about basically looking at that person and saying, I'm not going to treat you as valuable unless you do something for me. And Roger said that was really inappropriate. No matter what a person does for you, their basic value should never be in question. But nevertheless, people put conditions of worth on other people, and especially Rogers was concerned about parents putting conditions of worth on their children. That leads to this idea of incongruence. Incongruence, as opposed to congruence, is the idea that you start managing your self-concept in order to meet the conditions of worth of other people and therefore get the positive regard that you're after. So you stunt yourself, you manipulate yourself, you mold what ought to be a beautiful and unique you into constraints that were artificially placed there by other people. And that is a thing that can go wrong. And that can end up shaping the parts of personality that we don't particularly like. A problematic personality or an aggressive one or a hostile one. To Rogers is somebody who has forced themselves into incongruence with themselves over conditions of worth. It's really hard to discuss any of these things without going the last extra mile and talking about UCPR, unconditional positive regard. Because Rogers was a therapist, this all wrapped into his idea about how it is to help people, to get them feeling better. And his entire approach from beginning to end was nothing more than demonstrating unconditional positive regard for another person. No stories about their upbringing, no narratives about their ego or where their superego came from or repressed childhood trauma or anything like that. You sat with the person and you demonstrated to that person consistently that you valued them, you value their existence, they have every right to humanity, and that you are not going to question that that is an unshakable regard that you have for that person. It doesn't mean approving of everything that they do, it just means approving of their value as a person. And Carl Rogers said that that was basically all that was necessary for therapeutic change. Kind of like Mr. Rogers. Am I right? Am I right? Am I right? Am I right? All right. Next in the humanist tradition was Abraham Maslow. You remember the hierarchy of needs. Maslow's idea on personality was that wherever people are in meeting their needs, their physiological, safety, social esteem, or self-actualization needs, would be their way of interacting with the world, would be their pattern of responding to the world, which is basically what personality is to Abraham Maslow. So if you were seeking safety, you'd have a certain personality that reflects your pursuit of that thing. If you were looking for esteem, you would have a personality that reflected the ability to either meet or be starving for that esteem. And Maslow said that you could take this journey up the hierarchy of needs from a couple of different perspectives. One was the deficiency orientation, is that you are worried about not having what it is that you need or what it is that you want, or you're worried about losing what it is that you need or what it is that you want. And this harkens way back to Gray's explanation for the personality dimensions when we first started. Now, I gotta be honest, If Maslow is at all right, and I thought about this as an introspection on myself, I would say deficiency orientation has largely been the story of my life. I try to be content with what I have. I'm not really looking to move up the corporate ladder or be fabulously wealthy or anything like that. But I get motivated at the end of things to do what I need to do to make sure that I don't suffer consequences. I'm a procrastinator, and if you're a procrastinator, you might also be driven by deficiency orientation. Motivation doesn't really happen until you're worried that everything's going to go wrong if you don't get your work done. Growth orientation is the opposite. You look forward to what it is that life is going to be like when you get the next level on the hierarchy met. You're looking forward to your actualization. You're looking forward to engaging in the esteem of others. You're looking forward to the day when you'll be a little bit better off and a little bit happier and a little bit more self-actualized and have grown more than you grew today. That'd be a really nice thing to have, and I think that Maslow would say that a healthy approach to life would be to pursue that growth orientation, if at all possible. All right, now we talked about trait theories, and trait theories came about by measuring how you describe people and then trying to measure a little bit about how those descriptions went together, but it didn't really get down to, except for maybe the Myers-Briggs, figuring out what a person's individual personality would actually look like. So let's get back to that in just a second, but as promised, I'm giving you a short comedy break. It slayed when I was in college. It's only about 3.5 minutes long. It is Brack's Tales of Suspense.
So I went to the grocery store and I went to get some milk. So anyway, I got there and the store clerk looked at me and he said, "Well, hi there, Brack. Are you here to get some milk?" And I said, "Well, what if I am?" And he said, "Well, I was just asking, 'cause you forgot last time, remember?" And I said, "Oh, thanks. Yeah." So I went through the aisles, past the bread, past the cold cuts, past the cookies, past the ketchup, past the frozen dinners. One of them, by the way, looked really good. It had 3 mini hamburgers and some corn, and get this, tater tots and chocolate pudding. All the 4 major food groups. 2 hours later, I came to the dairy cage and I got some milk. And I brought it home. And my mom said, "Oh, Brack, you remember the milk?" And I said, "Yup." And then all of a sudden she said, "Brack, did you look at this? The expiration date says tomorrow." So I had to drink a whole gallon of milk in one day and go back and get some more. So, you gotta watch those expiration dates there.
I guess grocery store trips didn't used to actually have real dread associated with them like they do now, but hope you enjoyed that. All right, so I said we talked about personality in terms of describing it. We talked about personality theories in terms of how you get your personality. And now it's time to talk a little bit about personality measurement. Personality measurement is a whole field on its own, and there are a few different reasons why somebody might want to measure personality. A couple of them are clinical, and others of them are basically, curiosity, or to assess somebody's ability to do a job or work in a group. One of the classic ways of getting somebody's personality is a thing called a projective test. Projective testing is all about having people project meaning onto ambiguous stimuli, which is supposed to reveal the approach that they take to things in their world, and therefore reveal their personality. So the Freudians were kind of fond of this. If you've heard of the ink blots, the Rorschach test, Rorschach, the character in, oh my God, is it DC Comics, has that kind of weird pattern on his face. That's an ink blot from a Rorschach test. That is a projective test, an attempt to measure personality. One of the projective tests that is most in use right now is the thematic apperception test. You give people pictures and you ask them to describe what's going on in the picture, and the clinician is assigned the role of doing their best to pick out themes in people's descriptions. Now, this isn't a totally free floating interpretation on the part of the clinician. There are coding books and guidebooks and certifications and practice and ways that you're supposed to do that so that you aren't just totally willy-nilly writing down whatever you think is going on for your client when they start describing these pictures. But it still is nevertheless a problem. Thematic apperception tests, projective tests, they do have their advantages. They are great because they allow flexibility. You aren't stuck in a particular way of describing somebody's personality. You aren't limited to like the big five in terms of personality dimensions. You are not restricted to a certain vocabulary. If somebody seems to be doing something that's a little bit unusual to you as a clinician, you can follow up with that. You can ask about that. You can tailor your description to the person who is in front of you, which means you can individualize it, which is great. But in science, there is always a trade-off between personal individualization on a test and the accuracy of that test writ large to describe a phenomenon that is scientifically valid. So that gets us right into why these tests are not so great, is because if you give the same test to the same person with a different clinician, or you give the same test with the same clinician to a couple of different people, you might realize that that test isn't necessarily consistent in giving answers that rely only on the personality of the person being tested, which is what they're supposed to be measuring. The biggest reason for this, one of the biggest reasons for this, one of the biggest problems with it then is because there are two minds at work whenever you do a projective test. There is the mind of the person who is being tested, who is making the answers, who is describing the pictures, and then there is the mind of the clinician, which cannot help but come to the table with a few pre-existing assumptions. Here's an extreme example. So we've got a young man sitting here with a picture. The clinician is paying attention to what they're saying about the picture, and the young man says, "This woman seems sad." If you can see the picture, maybe you can agree with that. That appears to be a person who is holding a door in a skirt with her head in her hands. But what could be going on in the mind of the clinician? Oh my God, he's obsessed with sad women. What a psychopath. If anybody has had an experience with a person who is convinced that they know how to read other people's minds, you will quickly come to realize, and don't let it be you. Don't let you think that your introductory psychology class has given you unbelievable insight into the brains of your family and friends. But if you know somebody like that, you'll quickly realize that what they are doing when they try to describe the deep inner workings of other people around them is basically nothing more than articulating their own assumptions and calling it yours. So here's another example of a projective test. This is a Rorschach ink blot. And so what could I say about it? All right, what could I say about that particular Rorschach ink blot? And I'll tell you what that Rorschach ink blot is to me. That Rorschach ink blot is, and I don't know what you might think it is, but as far as I'm concerned, it has never been more clearly a uterus. Never more clearly an illustration of a uterus than anything I've ever seen in my life. Take a look at there. There's the fallopian tubes, there's the birth canal, there's the uterus itself. And not only that, but look, if you can see around the top edge, there's some just some like feathers and stuff like that. That is clearly endometriosis around the fallopian tubes and ova of a person who's going to be ending up with reproductive issues. Now, if you wanted to interpret that response as a clinician, for me, you could do a couple of different things, and it would depend on my history. You could say, what a pervert. He is totally obsessed with sex. Sex. That's not a uterus. That's a couple of camels looking in either directions, or it's a horizon. It's a sunset. But if you knew my history and you knew that both of my children were incredibly difficult to come by biologically, for reproductive reasons that we may not even ever still understand, then reproductive endocrinology might have really been on my mind for reasons that have nothing to do with my obsessions. At least not obsessions about sex, might have been obsessions about getting over the problems inherent in making babies at the time. So who's to say? The clinician is to say. Who's to say the clinician is always right? Well, nobody. So you've always got to take it for what it's worth. You got to take it with a grain of salt. Which is kind of why I'm a larger fan of the non-projective tests. The non-projective tests are objective in a way that they give the exact same questionnaire to every single person, and they code those questions in the same way for everyone, so that at the very least, results can be consistent across people. And the only thing that can really cause a non-projective test to have a problem is differences in people and how they approach the test, which, interestingly enough, is exactly what that test is trying to get at in the first place. So, the NEOPI-3, that is the neuroticism, extroversion, openness, all the big five that was explicitly made by McRae and Costa, the people who came up with those 5 personality dimensions. That is a test that anybody can take and get an idea about where they fall on all 5 of the big 5 personality dimensions. It's an interesting discussion tool. It's an interesting therapeutic tool if you want to help people to get an understanding about who they are, if that might help them feel like they have control over their world, great and fine. The other one, though, is a really interesting one called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. I like this for a couple of reasons. First off, it is huge. It is hundreds of questions long. It is extensive. And it will help to identify personality disorders. It will help to identify people on the clinical end of personality traits, which is going to be an interesting discussion for our pathology chapter. But the basic long and short of it is this. We are all a little bit neurotic. We are all a little bit narcissistic. We are all a little bit of whatever it is that would otherwise turn into a personality disorder if it got out of control. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, along with the MCMI, Million Clinical Multi-Axis Inventory, are tests that are designed to say, look, we know you're going to be a little bit neurotic, but depending on how you answer these questions, you may be over the line into an extreme neuroticism or an extreme problematic reaction to other people or germs or yourself. So that's what's going on with the MMPI, and here's how they did it. This is what's known as a data-driven test design. They didn't start with assumptions about what kind of questions would be good questions and then sorted through those like they did with the NEOPI. What the MMPI did was they just took all the questions they could think of, didn't matter whether it sounded crazy or not, and asked people who were already a part of a health system, who had already been carrying diagnoses of personality problems, to fill out these questionnaires. If a lot of people with antisocial personality disorder ended up answering a particular question true all the time, but people without that disorder didn't have a tendency to answer that question true, that question, no matter its content, became an item on the test that could be used to discriminate antisocial personality from others. And the whole test is basically like that. They just threw everything against the wall and they saw what stuck to people with personality disorders and what didn't. So here's a little example of what, 23 questions on the MMPI might look like or might sound like, okay? They're all true-false questions too. There's no scales 1 to 5. It's all just yes or no, true or false. I like mechanics magazines, true or false. I have a good appetite. I wake up fresh and rested in the mornings. I think I would enjoy the work of a librarian. I am easily awakened by noise. My father is a good man, or if your father is dead, my father was a good man. I like to read newspaper articles on crime. My hands and feet are usually warm enough. My hands and feet are usually warm enough? My daily life is full of things that keep me interested. I am about as able to work as I ever was. There seems to be a lump in my throat much of the time. My sex life is satisfactory. People should try to understand their dreams and be guided by or take warning from them. Not like Paul Triple dreams, like dreams you have when you're asleep dreams. I enjoy detective or mystery stories. I work under a great deal of tension. Once in a while, I think of things too bad to talk about. I am sure I get a raw deal from life. I am troubled by attacks of nausea and vomiting. When I take a new job, I like to find out who is important to be nice to. I am very seldom bothered by constipation. At times, I have very much wanted to leave home. No one seems to understand me. At times, I have fits of laughing and crying that I cannot control. Now, some of those might sound like, yeah, that's getting at something important psychologically. Other ones might be like, what the hell is that all about? But the reason they are on the test is because the data have shown historically that some people with certain personality traits answer it true and other people don't. The other thing, and you can see on the little chart that's up on the slide, there are a bunch of different variables along the bottom, okay? And there are 3 variables that are to the left of the line. Those are the L, well, the one that I really like the most is the L. L, by the way, on this measure is called the lie scale. At the same time that it's asking you hundreds of questions about your constipation and the shows that you like to watch, there are a couple of questions that are in there explicitly to detect how likely you are to just be lying on this test. So, a couple of those questions are, if I was unable to get into a movie theater for a film that I really, really wanted to see, and as I was leaving, I saw the door open to the theater, nobody was around, and I could just slip in and take an empty seat, would you do it? The answer is yes, people would do it. But if you want to fake good or lie, you have a tendency to say, no, I wouldn't do that on the test. And that gets marked on the test as a reason to doubt the results of the test. If you answer enough of those lie scale items in a socially desirable way, but not a truthful way, then there's a way of detecting whether or not people should really interpret the results of that test. So anyway, that's just an interesting thing about the MMPI. That is then the end of chapter 11. We are done with the material that will be on your test on Friday. Once again, please be online, ready to take an online exam, very easy, multiple choice, on Friday at 2 o'clock. I will leave that open till 4 o'clock. It probably shouldn't take you any longer than a paper and pencil test takes, just saying. But in order to be flexible, I've given more than double time to everyone. Email me if there are reasonable questions that you think I can answer relatively quickly. Also, you can show up to office hours on Wednesday during class time. I will again be logged into Blackboard, waiting for people who want to come by and ask a question or two. Between then and now, though, again, stay healthy, stay safe. I will talk to you again soon.